Hi and welcome everyone. My name is Tasha Tupin. I'm the Social Justice Coordinator for the Archdiocese of Regina, and it is my sincere pleasure to welcome you all this evening to our excellent presentation. Before we get started, I do want to do a land acknowledgement. So I want to take this opportunity for us all to pause and to give thanks for the beautiful land that we are on from the Creator. We pause to also remember and honor all those people and creatures that have walked this land before us. I also invite us to take a moment of silence to ask for forgiveness for the hurt and pain, the broken treaties, promises, families, and the genocide that has taken place on this land. The ways in which we have demonized and divided ourselves. May we come to grow as sisters and brothers in good relationship with all the people who live on this land. And may we move forward on the path of reconciliation each day together in a good way. So I just invite you to take a second and to ponder what this means to you, to recognize the land you're on. And if you would like in the chat, you can say the land that you're on, the people whose land it is. We'll just pause a moment for that. I also want to take this opportunity to introduce Chris Yurenko. Chris Yurenko is a professor and department head of religion and culture at the University of Saskatchewan at St. Thomas More College. He's also the director of the Center for Faith, Reason, Peace, and Justice. And he researches many topics, and I'll just name a few that might be most interesting to you, but culture and sustainability. He does eco-ethics and peace and social justice, and like I said, many, many more. The Center for Faith, Reason, Peace, and Justice is one of our sponsors for tonight's event, and it is because of their great Zoom capabilities and their technical resources, the human resources that they've donated this evening, that we are all here and able to gather. The other sponsor is the Archdiocese of Regina, which I work for. And our third sponsor, who we would not be able to do this without, is all thanks to the Dubé chair. And so we really want to thank all our sponsors and all of you for attending, for your listening ears, and for your thoughtful questions. So as far as questions go, you can enter your questions throughout the presentation into the chat. Chris will be gathering those and putting together your questions to bring to Senator Roche. You can also email him your questions if it's a little bit more lengthy, and he will be bringing those forward on behalf of all of us gathered here today. So that's kind of all the housekeeping things. And with that, it is my most sincere pleasure to introduce to you the man of the hour, Senator Douglas Roche. And so a little bit about this wonderful man. We are really lucky to be here tonight with him and to share this time with him. I think he's probably forgotten more than most of us know, so don't be afraid to ask questions. Senator Douglas Roche has a wide-ranging discussion tonight to share with us on some of the greatest dangers faced by humankind and how we can work together to fashion a future free from existential threats, fear, and suffering. The former parliamentarian and diplomat and prodigious activist and author will offer 10 topics of conversation, each of which presents an imminent danger to the world. The topics tonight will include the crises of climate change, the coronavirus, and nuclear weapons, as well as the present chaos in global policymaking. Senator Roche will also speak about the human rights of migrants and his hopes for the UN Security Council in dealing with this global problem. Can the common bond of our humanity raise hope that enlightened governments and vigorous civil society will protect the common good? And it is at this point that I turn the mic over, and I thank you all for your questions and comments. Thank you very much, Senator.
We must lift ourselves up from the daily headlines and scan the horizon with the same vision of peace shown in 1945. And to that vision, we must now add a hard, pragmatic reality, knowing from the experience of continuing conflict that national blinders must be torn off to truly develop a culture of peace. Humanity has never been so challenged. We must shake off our ennui and act. Here are 10 steps for common survival. First, recognize the crises of climate change, pandemics, and nuclear weapons affect all. COVID-19 has turned out our world upside down, says UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres. Life everywhere has been upended by the pandemic, an attack on the health, life, mental well-being, and livelihoods of hundreds of millions of people. The climate emergency is worsening. Inequality and poverty are deepening. Perpetual nuclear weapons modernization by 9 states makes a mockery of arms control agreements. Conflicts are spinning out of control. History has never recorded such a challenge to the continued existence of life on Earth. These crises are but the most visible signs of a fracturing world. There is also the constant scar of poverty, discrimination, violence, and exclusion that result from ethnic hatreds and a general lack of trust among peoples even within their own lands. There is a growing disconnect between people and institutions that serve them, with many feeling left behind and no longer confident that the system is working for them. Mistrust and division are driving people apart at a time when solidarity and collaboration are needed more than ever. The Prime Minister of tiny Barbados, Mia Amor Motley, pleaded with the UN General Assembly a few days ago, "How many more crises need to hit before we see that the international system divides, not lifts," she said. Then she added, "We are waiting for global, moral, strategic leadership." The peace-building institutions so laboriously constructed over decades are now not trusted for the principal reason that political leaders have failed to stand up and actually lead people forward to a more just and secure world. Time is now running out. Second, replace the present chaos with global cooperation in policymaking. There is a way forward. Secretary General Guterres has issued an urgent report called Our Common Agenda, which provides a new basis for hope that the world can experience a breakthrough rather than continued breakdown. He says a stark choice confronts us: to continue with business as usual and risk significant breakdown and perpetual crisis, or to make concerted efforts to break through and achieve an international system that delivers for people and the planet. In short, Guterres is appealing for common sense. He puts forward programs to implement 12 critical commitments already made by states at the 75th anniversary of the UN. Here they are: leave no one behind, protect the planet, promote peace and prevent conflict, abide by international law and ensure justice, place women and girls at the center, build trust, improve digital cooperation, upgrade the United Nations, ensure sustainable financing, boost partnerships, listen to and work with youth, be prepared for future crises, including but not limited to public health crises. To advance all these themes, Guterres wants to instigate a social contract among nations and hold a set of global summits, including a Summit of the Future in 2023. He's trying to involve governments, principal international institutions, and civil society to forge a new global consensus on strengthening human security. This bold idea should now be backed up by regular summits of the UN Security Council, and Canada should press to have Guterres' plan taken up. Just as the founders of the UN came together to determine to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war, the modern world must now come together to save succeeding generations from not only war, but climate change, pandemics, hunger, poverty, injustice, and a host of risks that we may not yet foresee entirely. This is our common agenda. Third, change the US versus China dynamic to promote global solutions. No set of political relationships in the world are so dangerous and yet so promising as those between the US and China. They are the behemoths of the 21st century. Though they have become deeply intertwined through trade and supply chains over the past 40 years, they are destined to compete for world influence. In fact, world politics is now being characterized as a gigantic struggle between the democracies headed by the US and the authoritarian model of China. China sees the West in decline, and the West fears that China's economically powerful Belt and Road Initiative will give it a political leverage over much of the world of the future. Neither China nor the US has clean records. Domestically, the US has made much progress in enshrining human rights, but on the world stage, the US government has overthrown many progressive governments in Latin America and the Middle East, and violated international law by starting the Iraq War in 2003, which destabilized and set back the whole region. Conversely, China routinely violates basic human rights and has persecuted the Uyghur Muslims in the northwestern territory of Xinjiang in what many have labeled as genocide. Beijing has also quashed the efforts of pro-democracy demonstrators at home and in Hong Kong, and authoritarianism may be giving way to totalitarianism. Yet modern China has thus far refrained from exercising its military might, and its military spending is only 1/3 of the $768 billion United States defense budget. Nonetheless, China has stepped up its espionage and cyber warfare against US corporate, academic, and military targets. Now, both leaders affirm that they want the UN Charter values to prevail. On September the 20th, President Biden told the General Assembly, and I quote, "We are not seeking a new Cold War or a world divided into rigid blocs. We'll continue to uphold the long-standing rules and norms that have formed the guardrails of international engagement for decades," unquote. When he spoke in the same debate, President Xi said, and I quote again, "The Chinese people have always celebrated and striven to pursue the vision of peace, amity, and harmony. China has never and will never invade or bully others or seek hegemony." There is only one set of rules, that is, the basic norms governing international relations underpinned by the purposes and principles of the UN Charter, unquote. Common ground between the US and China does exist, though each can wreak untold damage on the other. Each should take a pragmatic approach to coexistence in the name of common survival. That is the course they should follow for the benefit of the whole world. Other states, notably Canada, should be encouraging US-China bilateral cooperation as a direct means of strengthening the multilateral systems. Diplomacy was not invented for friends to enjoy each other's company. It exists to provide a stable relationship between enemies and should be utilized in a positive manner through trade and humanitarian measures for the benefit of all parties. Fourth, reinvigorate sustainable development goals to beat back the coronavirus. The UN's 17 Sustainable Development Goals were launched in 2015 as a 15-year program to eradicate the worst forms of poverty. A 5-year review in 2020 found sluggish performance. More than 700 million people, or 10% of world population, still live in extreme poverty, struggling to fulfill the most basic needs like health, education, and access to water and sanitation. COVID-19 worsened this tragedy, pushing millions back into extreme poverty. The most vulnerable people, those with the least resources, many of whom already displaced by climate change, were the ones struck hardest by the pandemic. A massive global vaccination program has now become a chief priority, and this, in turn, unfortunately reduces the priority for other development programs. The Sustainable Development Goals' success depends on huge infusions of money. Some of this comes from private institutions, but governments of rich countries are a primary source. It is here that a scandalous anomaly shows the ugliness of modern politics. Governments that claim they have insufficient funds for social spending at home and abroad nevertheless appropriate huge sums every year to their military operations. They devote to the Sustainable Development Goals only a minuscule part of the $2 trillion spent annually on the military. Our common agenda makes a plea to reduce excessive military budgets and ensure adequate social spending. But the tentacles of the military-industrial complex are so strong that they strangle the few efforts being made today to transfer even a portion of the funds spent on military operations to economic and social development. The pandemic is teaching us that human security does not come from the barrel of a gun, but it is a hard lesson. Fifth, prioritize immediate environmental action to hold temperature rise to 1.5 degrees centigrade. Rich or poor, isolated or metropolitan, north or south, there is no escaping the effects of climate change. This is not a future crisis, it is a world emergency of the first order. Already scientists say the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is higher than anything in at least the last 3 million years. We are already at 1.2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels and rising rapidly. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change warned in 2021 that we are at an imminent risk of hitting the dangerous threshold of 1.5 degrees. Every fraction of a degree represents lost lives, livelihoods, assets, species, and ecosystems. We should be dramatically reducing emissions each year towards a 45% reduction by 2030 and net zero emissions by 2050, yet temperatures continue to rise. With all the bad news dragging us down, we ought to be uplifted by the good news that renewable energy can save the world from burning up. The power from the sun and wind will be able to supply all the world's electricity needs in perhaps a couple of decades. Carbon emissions from fossil fuels will be a thing of the past. Of course, a decarbonized world cannot happen overnight, but the speed of renewable energy developments is amazing. The price of renewable energy is falling rapidly, the end of coal is in sight, and new technologies are rapidly being deployed. Despite the progress, a new jolt is needed to deal adequately with the scale of the climate crisis. That jolt is a deliberate phasing down of the fossil fuel industry to drastically reduce greenhouse gases. It is not likely that the political process can summon up the courage to take up such deliberate action, or will dampen consumer demand for products that require increasing amounts of energy. The world is not going to return to an agricultural economy. But technology, using innovative techniques and market forces, can quickly utilize renewable energy and thus reduce the rise in global temperatures. A combination of political and industrial leadership around the world is necessary to get this done. Upheavals in lives will be necessary. Sixth, acknowledge the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons as an aid to fulfilling the Non-Proliferation Treaty and eliminate nuclear weapons. Fear of widespread proliferation of nuclear weapons drove nations to construct the Non-Proliferation Treaty, called the NPT, which entered into force in 1970. The treaty was essentially a bargain. Non-nuclear weapon states would forsake any attempt to acquire them in return for the nuclear weapons possessors to negotiate their elimination. While widespread proliferation has been averted, the number of nuclear states has been held to 9, modernization of existing stocks of more than 13,000 nuclear weapons continues, and the threat of a nuclear catastrophe, either accidental or deliberate, is worsening as international relations deteriorate. President Biden and Russia's President Putin have repeated the soothing dictum that a nuclear war can never be won and must never be fought, but this assurance is belied by their aggressive nuclear postures. Both the US and Russia hold 2,000 nuclear weapons on constant alert. The moral and legal cases against nuclear weapons are now growing. The persistent refusal of the nuclear weapon states to honor their moral and legal obligations created so much frustration among progressive governments and civil society activists that a humanitarian movement developed to push back against the powerful states. Led by such progressive countries as Mexico, Ireland, and Austria, and by a loose civil society coalition centered on the international campaign to abolish nuclear weapons, the movement succeeded in the UN adopting, on July 7, 2017, a treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons. The treaty, which entered into force in 2021, is a landmark and further testimony to the rising tide of conscientious governments and civil society activists fighting to strengthen human society. For the first time, nuclear weapons have been unconditionally stigmatized as standing outside international humanitarian law. The nuclear weapon states and NATO have all vigorously rejected the Prohibition Treaty, falsely claiming it undermines the NPT. Actually, the Prohibition Treaty complements the NPT and strengthens the process leading to comprehensive negotiations for the elimination of nuclear weapons. The NPT, at its forthcoming review conference, should acknowledge the value of the Prohibition Treaty. Seventh, protect human rights of migrants forced to flee for economic, political, and climate reasons. There are presently more than 80 million forcibly displaced people in the world. The extraordinary series of weather disruptions as the planet heats, the floods, rising sea levels, fires, and droughts, is making millions of people homeless. According to the UN's Institute for Environment and Human Security, we don't know how many are climate migrants because often those who experience climate stresses are also affected by conflict situations, political instability, low levels of economic development, and human rights abuses. A person's total environmental surroundings, including climate change impacts, comprise multiple factors in a decision to leave home. Furthermore, a lot of movement more directly attributable to climate stresses is within a country, such as from rural to urban areas, and not across international borders. Every conflict produces more refugees, and the pandemic has exacerbated this open wound of humanity. Pressure is growing on developed countries to take in more of the homeless of the world. Some nations are building walls to halt the rising tide of migration. Hungary fenced off its boundary with Serbia. India has built a fence along most of its 2,500-mile border with Bangladesh. Donald Trump tried, but did not succeed, to build a wall shutting off migration from Mexico. Compounding the wall mentality is the stinting on foreign aid by developed countries, a situation that traps the poorest people of the world into even more starvation, dangers, and conflict, a tragedy made all the worse by COVID-19. While taking in the homeless is an essential act of civilized people, the growing migrant problem needs a bigger solution. Secretary General Guterres wants a social summit to be held, and I quote him, "We urgently need a renewed social contract anchored in a comprehensive approach to human rights in the light of the pandemic and beyond, one that allows many more actors to tackle increasingly complex and interconnected problems," unquote. Social justice demands more than charity. Governments should follow the UN's lead in developing a vibrant social contract to guarantee the conditions for people to live a decent life, leaving no one behind and enabling all to participate in society as promised in the 2030 Agenda. This means measures to address discrimination and to ensure that human rights are protected and people can meet their basic needs. Food, healthcare, water and sanitation, education, and decent work are basic human rights. Eighth, increase the role of women in parliamentary and government decision-making processes. No meaningful social contract is possible without the active and equal participation of women and girls. That is a core belief Guterres expresses in our common agenda. Women do groundwork break for justice, peace, and security, yet they continue to be sidelined in formal peace processes. Despite strong evidence in favor of their inclusion, women remain largely invisible in and sidelined from formal peace processes and negotiations. Since the adoption of the Beijing Declaration and Platform of Action in 1995, one of the most comprehensive roadmaps toward gender equality and women's rights worldwide, including in the area of peace and security, there has been some progress, but inequality persists. Between 1992 and 2018, women were only 13% of negotiators, 3% of mediators, and only 4% of signatories in major peace processes. Even when women play instrumental roles in forging and sustaining peace, when they are at the table, we don't hear enough about their contributions. Too often, media narratives portray women as vulnerable victims, failing to acknowledge their crucial work to bridge deep divides and mend their communities. Guterres, who has filled the top ranks of the UN with women, has pledged to change this deficiency. The organization UN Women now runs training programs to prepare women for political leadership. The Secretary General says the United Nations itself will ensure gender parity in all levels within the organization by 2028. We will also undertake a review of United Nations systems capacity, staffing, resources, and architecture to deliver on gender equality as a core priority. That's from the Secretary General. The next step is for a woman to assume the Secretary General's job, and chances are increasing that that will happen in the next election. Ninth, Respect a rising global conscience. Religions must address the moral crisis of human survival. The issues of life and death are inherently moral issues, and good order demands an accounting. Broadening moral discourse about the need for international institutions to uphold the good values of life that all seek is an act of moral leadership. The prime example of putting moral values in play globally was the creation of the United Nations, which provided the institutional framework for the rules-based international liberal order established after World War II. The uplifting of the human being able to live in peace, which is the driving idea behind the UN, is a great act of morality. Yet the uplifting of all humanity is continually thwarted by gross disparities. The wealth of billionaires increased by over $3.9 trillion between March and December 2020, while 4 billion people are still without any form of basic social protection. That the rich benefit from the suffering of the poor in a pandemic is a disgraceful reflection of the paucity of social justice in the pandemic. It shows the lack of social justice in the world. Solving the myriad problems unleashed by the pandemic, global warming, and nuclear weapons requires a moral way of thinking that puts the wellness of the human being at the center of policymaking. Such an opening of the moral lens leads the way to social justice policies. Despite the agonies of the modern world reflected every day in the headlines and consequently dominating the thinking of so many, there is an uplifting of humanity taking place. A global conscience is awakening in the world about how we are treating the planet. This discernible sense of caring for vulnerable people and for the planet itself may explain the unexpected popularity of Pope Francis's 2015 encyclical on care for our common home, known by its Latin title Laudato Si. Addressed to every person on the planet, the letter critiques consumerism and irresponsible development, laments environmental degradation and global warming, and calls for everyone to take immediate and unified global action. Tenth, feel the common bond of our humanity to raise hopes that governments and civil society will protect the common good. Out of the suffering, gloom, and seemingly perpetual conflict in the world is emerging a new standard by which we judge right and wrong. Our world is being lifted up, often despite us. We are still mired in conflict, but we yearn to break free from the old bonds that have encased us in our private domains. Increasingly, we recognize that colossal miseries may yet lie ahead. Apathy drags us down. But failures in building the conditions for peace ought not to obscure our vision of where humanity is heading in the 21st century. There is a growing recognition of the need for common security. Now we need to affirm that the route to that security lies in public policies built on global conscience. We who have a vision of a more just world cannot allow the cynics to dissuade us from pressing on. There's a strong support across the world for public policies to restore hope to populations long exploited by callous economic systems. A recent global poll conducted in 19 countries across 5 continents that is, reveals a world eager for multilateral institutions to take the lead on pressing issues from climate change to terrorism to human rights. The crises we are facing cry out for UN leadership. We may not have reached sufficient maturity of civilization to enforce the right to peace. Governments, at least some of them, are still too strong and are able to overcome the wishes of those who've turned against the old culture of war. But this situation will not prevail forever. It will give way to those who demand the right to peace, just as the forces of slavery, colonialism, and apartheid gave way when the opposition became strong enough That is why developing the elements of a culture of peace, education, sustainable development, respect for all human rights, equality between men and women, democratic participation, understanding and tolerance, free flow of information, and human security for all is so important and hopeful. Thank you for staying with me through that 10-point lecture, and now I'm very happy to take questions and to hear your comments.
So that was wonderful, high production value, probably the best video that we've seen so far from one of these webinars. So I have some questions that have come in via email. So we were hoping, in order to give the most airtime to Senator Roche, that if you could, just while you're thinking, either put them in the chat or send me an email with the question. And I'll start with one that we have already. So this is actually from one of my colleagues who teaches here, a dedicated teacher who shall remain anonymous. She thanks you very much for your presence tonight and your wisdom that you shared. And she was wondering a little bit about what you think the most effective ways are for everyday people to advocate for these necessary changes. And specifically, if you could also comment on the role of educators in modeling that advocacy and inviting our students into it.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Chris, and to all of you who are participating here tonight. I'll give a one-word answer to the first part of that question, and that word is voice. We must raise our voices so that the political establishment and the social order, the media hear us. Too many of us are silent. We bemoan all the crises and the conflict, and we sort of try to sweep it aside to get on with our lives. But as I've tried to explain here, the intersectional nature of all these crises is an absolutely unprecedented situation in our planet. And the present political order is not up to the demands that have been raised by these various crises. The pandemic is just the top tip of the iceberg. The climate, nuclear weapons, migration, all the things that I've said. So raise our voice. How? Well, contacting parliamentarians, a new set of parliamentarians, or a renewed set, entering the Canadian Parliament now, the media, letters to the editor. When I was a politician, an active politician, I guess I'm still a politician, but when I was an active politician, I recognized the importance of every single letter because it represents 10 or 15 people who didn't write. And so raising our voice. And then secondly, participating in organizations. In any community, wherever you are, there are organizations in the fields that are centered on the peace issues, whether it's arms control and disarmament, environmental protection, economic and social development, human rights. And participating allows us to grow ourselves in a particular field and contribute even in a small way. But how important that is when the voices and participation of people multiply. So education has a very strong role to play in this. The happiest days of my life, I think, were spent when I was a professor at the University of Alberta for 13 years, and I dealt with, at a 400 level course on war, peace in the 21st century, with young people aged about 20 or 21. It's a perfect age to teach people that. And the sensitivity that they felt toward the issues and the way they responded showed me the power of education. And I used to tell them, never underestimate the power of an idea, where an idea will go. So I just want to give all my full support to the teachers who are here tonight. The role that you're playing, whether you're teaching math or science or religion, whatever you're teaching, you're an influence, and your own character and person and belief system in a better world, that's communicated to your students. The communication of how we feel and want about the world is the foremost step to take to making it better.
Thank you very much for that first answer. Yeah, now the questions are flooding in, so that's great. I have a question about the importance of peace education in particular to all this. So that particular framing of having peace education. And before I ask the question more directly, I'll just use this moment to mention that we are starting a peace studies program. That's why we have the peace studies lecture. It started, we've had the classes going now for a while. Next term, there'll be an intro to peace studies class and also a peace theory and praxis class. So if people are interested in that, more information about that, they can also just email me. So I'll use that moment. But Senator Roche, can you comment on the particular importance of peace education for all this?
Yeah, the United Nations has had peace education and youth programs of a rather wide nature. The Secretary General wants to have a youth, he's already got a youth sort of envoy, but he wants a youth department in the UN, because he recognizes that young people are not leaders, not just to be regarded as leaders of the future, but they are leaders of the present also, because they're so deeply affected by what is going on. So peace education needs to be brought into the systems in a much more integrated way than we now have. I don't think that nuclear weapons or the whole issue of nuclear weapons is taught nearly sufficiently to people, to students coming through the system. They emerge with some sort of degree or something, with very little knowledge of the practical realities of how the world is endangered by the modernization of nuclear weapons that is still going on. And I suppose now we're getting better education in climate change. That's coming in through the sciences, but education on human rights, education on economic and social development, are the sustainable development goals being taught in the schools? I mean, that's a question that teachers themselves need to wrestle with.
Thank you very much. Now we're going to turn to a question from a local peace activist who's thinking about the interplay between corporate power and political power. And directly she asks, do you think political leaders can really make the necessary changes, or is it the fact now that the corporate leaders are much more powerful?
Yeah, well, of course, I've wrestled with that one for a long time. I would not want to denigrate the importance of political leaders. I mean, they're the ones who set the government policy that enters the life streams of everybody. But they are, the whole system is heavily influenced by corporate power. And this is seen most dramatically, I suppose, or most terribly in the military-industrial complex, which really drives the political system in the United States. The United States has a militarized foreign policy as a result of the high spending of the United States. I said their budget was $768 billion, which is an enormous amount of money that is protected by both Democrats and Republicans on the Armed Services Committee, who run sort of a cabal because they receive, both Democrats and Republicans, they receive money, contributions from the defense industry. And the Pentagon has been very careful to apportion the defense contracts throughout the states so that local economies become dependent on defense for their own well-being. And so the corporate structure in the military and affecting the military industrial complex is remains a powerful thing. In Canada, I suppose you might say we're not as effective, but we shouldn't kid ourselves because it's still an influence here. And when one looks at the defense industry's funding of think tanks in Canada, it's far greater money is received by those organizations that are promoting more spending on defense than is received by peace organizations who are scrambling for money all the time. So the answer that I have had to perhaps fall back on in my own life is to raise your own conscience level of recognizing that our economic system is built on a form of capitalism that is exploitative, and that we have to raise our voices to get as much social protection for people as possible. And the tension between social justice advocates and the corporate structure is always there. And we have to continue to stand up for policies that provide more of the resources and benefits of our society for people, of course, people who are most vulnerable, but also people who are coping with daily life because they perhaps didn't have the advantages that the corporate structure provides for its own. So it's an unfair system that we live in, and I myself have struggled with this, and I just keep coming back to raising our voices on behalf of social justice, and gradually this penetrates. I mean, I think the payments made in the period of the pandemic, payments made to people who were out of work and so on is a reflection of a conscience that we have to protect. And that this was, of course, an extremist with the coronavirus. It was so dramatic that people need. But the larger scene prevails, namely that the economic social system needs to be based more on the needs of all people rather than just the affluence of those who are politically strong.
So a similar issue was raised in regards to the idea of a wealth tax from Phyllis Cretan. And she's asking you, would a national, so to maybe incentivize that sharing that you talked about, or that caring for the common good, would a national or international wealth tax be a constructive way to provide funds for addressing the climate crisis and the gross inequity and poverty across the world?
When the law of the sea was being formulated about 20, 30 years ago, there was a great push for an international tax on the production of minerals at the bottom of the sea. Here's a good that doesn't even exist yet. So nobody's getting hurt by a tax on this. It doesn't belong to anybody. It's in international waters. And the idea that was proposed at the time was that when the production of minerals at the bottom of the sea started, that there would be an international tax of maybe 0.25% or very small, but the benefits would go to economic and social development in the least developed countries to try to sort of even out, and particularly for countries that are landlocked. When that was put forward, there was a terrible hue and cry from the affluent and from the wealthy, and they defeated the idea. It was called the Tobin tax, after the founder of this idea. So this is part of my answer to your question about how difficult it is to have a wealth tax. They talk about it being sort of being talked about actively by the progressive politicians in the United States, who want to have a special tax on all those making over $400,000 a year. I think myself that that what we have to be careful in the application of a wealth tax, that it doesn't drive industries away from our own country, in the case of Canada, that it doesn't backfire, so to speak. A cautious movement forwarded progressive taxation is fair and doable. And I think that it requires a steady hand of economic and political leadership that is attuned to rectifying the disparities that now exist.
Okay, turning to Canadian complicity in all this, I'm going to try to combine a couple of questions. There's an idea that Canada had, or maybe is trying to reclaim this status as being peacekeepers. Yet we have a history that's intertwined with colonialism and imperialistic practices that have included aiding and training various military and paramilitary organizations. So based on that, how do we come to grips with that past, and how do we heal it in a way that's in line with your 10 steps?
Well, you've got two things, or maybe more, going on in that question and comment.
Yeah.
The question about our colonial past, and the second, our outreach through peacekeeping. Taking them one at a time, we're now much more aware of our colonial past. When I grew up, I wasn't aware of it at all, how we treated and how our society treated Indigenous people. Now we're very much aware, and in a shameful way, that Canada, this beacon of democracy that we like to think of ourselves, has had such a colonial past, repressive of the first peoples in our country. So we're trying to make up for this now. And are we doing enough? Clearly not, but at least the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and all its recommendations have brought so much to the fore. And the media is now, of course, moving on this issue, so that I think young people growing up today are much more sensitive and aware that we have a responsibility to our own people in our country. And thus, by extension, we understand our responsibility to vulnerable people everywhere. And so that leads us into the outreach of Canada into the world. And what do we have? We have a world of conflict in which regional wars are propagated by warlords, and God knows what kind of people that are starting these conflicts. And so the UN has stepped in with a long history of peacekeeping, going back to when Lester Pearson, our own prime minister, who won the Nobel Peace Prize for this proposal of having a peacekeeping force sent into the Suez Crisis in 1953. So Canada stood out in peacekeeping, and it was an extension of who we are and our outreach through the United Nations system to try to, if not resolve conflict, at least maybe keep a truce and enforce a truce. And for a long time, we were one of the leaders, but then that slipped away. And I've wrestled myself with why exactly Canada stopped being a leading peacekeeper. Did we lose faith in it? Would the world become too complicated, or was it too expensive, or the military themselves didn't like it? because the military were trained for combat. And when you go into the army, they don't, the whole idea of having armies is for combat. So the idea of a peacekeeping is to avoid combat. So there's a conflict of interest, so to speak, within the military that they have themselves had to overcome. So I'm not sure exactly why the reason, but the fact remains that we've now shamefully come down to about last figures I saw were something like 30 Canadians. That this involves police and judges and so on, and military, and engaged in the peacekeeping operations of the UN at this time. I repeat that, 30 Canadians, what it used to be, 100,000. So the role of Canada in stepping back from active participation in peacekeeping is one of the things we should definitely lament in this country, and it's one of the reasons why Canada was not elected to the Security Council. We've now gone through 2 elections in 2010 and 2020, which Canada was defeated. There's no one single reason why Canada, which has had a pretty good reputation in many fields. I mean, I've worked at the United Nations as a Canadian, so I'm quite aware of the extent of the Canadian outreach through the years. And I may say, when I sat at a desk at the United Nations with the word Canada in front of me, I was very proud to be able to be a representative of a country that has, in the 75-year history of the United Nations, made a great contribution to the overall issues of the UN peace agenda. That's economic or foreign aid, and also in peacekeeping. But we fell back on this. And I mean, this, I don't really want to get into the whole politics here in this gathering tonight, but it happened. If you had to pick a year when this thing started to go backwards or sideways, it was the year 2010. So you can figure out for yourself who was in power in Canada in the year 2010, and we started to slide, and the present government says we're back, but we're not quite sure what we're back for. And I attribute this whole question of peacekeeping, which is one indication of who and what we are, to the fact that we have ceased understanding as Canadians who we are in the world. Are we an appendage of the United States? Are we a figure of the United Nations? Where are we going in the 21st century? What's going to be our relationship with China? So some of my colleagues have been calling for some time for a total review of Canadian foreign policy, because we've had all these mixed messages going on over the past few years. And I myself can't make up my mind whether we now have a new government, just had an election, Parliament comes, and so it's just a time for a total review of Canadian foreign policy. It has some appeal on the surface, and if they had it, I wouldn't write against it. But I mean, I'm not too enthused about it, because a review of foreign policy gets all the academics going, and 2 years of studies and papers back and forth, and for every proposal that you put forward, there's a counter proposal. I mean, and the academics love all this stuff, and I would rather have much more action taken on what we already know is needed. And I said it in my lecture a few minutes ago about our common agenda put forward by the Secretary General. There's a brilliant outline of what is needed in the world, in economic and social development, and in nuclear, in an environment, in the issues that are gripping us now. I think, as I hear myself speaking at this very moment, I'm coming more to the conclusion we don't need more study on what our foreign policy should be. We should adapt a foreign policy now that is commensurate with the identification of the issues that the United Nations and Guterres has done. So we ought to pick up our socks and start moving. But to do that, we got to have some sort of belief system. What is it we really believe? What do we want as Canadians? What kind of world do we understand that our place in the world? Look at a map of our country on the world, and a world map. There's huge amounts of space that is occupied by a place called Canada. The geographical advantages we have in this world are fantastic. When you look at countries like Bangladesh or Myanmar, where there's people are crowded into it's unbearable scenes. So what a responsibility that we have. We need to wake up as Canadians and push our government toward policies already defined by the United Nations and move on this. So for that, we need some political leadership, but political leadership won't happen without a push. As Margaret Mead used to say, it's only people at the grassroots who can make things happen. And I think that probably there's truth in that. When you look at the apartheid and slavery and colonialism and things, the great social changes came about as a result of movements of people who believed. What do we believe today?
Okay, so I think I have time for maybe one more formal question, and I'll give you a choice, sort of combining sets of questions. There's a set of questions surrounding change, which is related to what you were just talking about, and the mechanism for change, whether it would be UN or grassroots, and the effectiveness of letter writing. Or I can ask you a question that a couple of students have asked, and they're interested in your sort of faith-inspired motivations for undertaking this work. So what do you think would be the best sort of last formal question?
I didn't quite understand. You're asking about whether the United Nations is a vehicle that we should use.
Oh, sorry, I'm saying we only have time for sort of one more formal question.
Yeah.
And a set of questions around mechanisms of change. And there's a set of questions that want to hear a little bit about your own personal motivations, particularly as they relate to your faith for undertaking that you have taken. So I'm asking you which sort of
I see.
Kind of question you would like to be asked.
Well, I'll take whatever you want, but my own motivation, it certainly interests me, I guess, if it interests anybody else. Why do I do this? Why do I do this? When I was a young man, I was a journalist and I traveled around the world. And I had a job, a very fortunate job. I went through Asia, Africa, Latin America in the early 1960s. And I got to know the world pretty well. And I woke up one morning and I said, Doug Roche, you made a great discovery. You should be in the Guinness Book of Records. You discovered that most of the world is non-white, non-Western, and non-Christian. And maybe we'll start to get along. And that idea has riveted through me through the years. And in later years, then, when I became active in Parliament and so on, started going to the United Nations. The United Nations, the General Assembly, has 193 countries, and each country has a desk with 6 people. So on a full day, there's a lot of people. So you go down into the well of the United Nations General Assembly on a full day, and you look up, and what do you see? And we look at the faces of the world. The faces of the modern world are right there and in one room. And what do you see? You see faces that are non-white, non-Western, and non-Christian. So I myself, I'm a real minority in the world, but I'm part of a system that's very arrogant in its claims and dominance of peoples around the world. And so this tension has roiled, I guess, through me through the years, and it brought me into politics, and where I had a chance, an opportunity, and I never lost the feeling of. I don't want to be misinterpreted here. I mean, I never lost the feeling of honor every time I walked onto the floor of the House of Commons or the floor of the Senate. I felt it was an honor to be able to do that, and I look back and feel the same way. But that being said, I was in tension most of the time I was there, because the system is geared for a transactional politics. You give, you take, you give, and this whatever issue it is, trying to come to compromises on things. And actually, what our world needs so much is transformative leadership, not transactional. So we need to transform our society. That's why I went into politics, and it was a burning experience. But you got to take the world as it is. You got to take the world as it is. And my own faith has certainly seen me through all of this. I believe very strongly that we are here on Earth are part of God's continuing plan for the creation, the development of the planet. And I don't have any messianic complex, that I can do all this, but I'm one person, and I'm fortunate that I have been able to use whatever I have in me, I can use. But everybody has something. We don't all have to be the Secretary General of the United Nations in order to achieve something. Every single person, whatever you do. So that got me through, and I believe that we have a responsibility to God here while we're occupying some space on the planet. And when we see the suffering and the vulnerability of the people, and of course the COVID has brought that out in so strongly now, it increases a sense of responsibility. So you combine this sense of personal responsibility with the social order, and recognizing that the social order must change to accommodate the needs of the millions, not the greed of the few. So this is an ongoing struggle, and you can keep this kind of answer going forever and get back to the whole question of good and evil in the world. So I take it one day. Now I'm taking it, of course, I'm at an age now where I'm lucky to have every day. So I take it one day at a time, and try to do what I can in writing and lecturing to help people to understand that out of all this gloom and doom that we see on the headlines, there is a creative world and a culture of peace that is being born, and it's thrilling to be part of it. I close this answer by saying I agree totally with Barack Obama, Obama said, if you could choose any time in the history of the world to be born, the best time to be born, this is now, because this is the time when we have such an opportunity. There's more opportunities available to people in every field than ever before. What a moment to be alive.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I'm so happy that you were able to end on a note of hope. For those of you who are in the world of social justice and are involved in some of these issues, it can be a touch overwhelming at times. So I'm glad that your faith is a spring of hope, and that I like your message that we all have something that we can contribute. And so I just encourage you all to take some time and ponder that. What is that contribution that you can do? What are those concrete steps that you can take to help actualizing some of these seemingly complex, but not inaccessible ways forward? So I just really want to thank you for that. And I want to thank all of you who have been here this evening with us. Thank you for your thoughts and for listening, for the work that you've done and that you're going to be continuing to do. I just want to take this opportunity to let you know about a couple of events that you might also be interested in. So this October 18th, so not too far from now, from noon until 1 p.m. Saskatchewan, Alberta time, which is 1 to 2 Manitoba time and 2 to 3 Eastern time, 11 to noon in BC. You are invited to take part in an online event to mark the second Global Multi-Religious Climate Action Days in advance of the COP26. Communities Inspired for Environmental Action, which is a local central Saskatchewan organization and chapter of the Faith and Common Good, in partnership with St. Thomas More College Center for Faith, Reason, Peace, and Justice, will be hosting an event focused on energy and how people of faith can positively influence Sask Power's policies. Guest speakers will include Peter Prebley and Reverend Karen Fraser Giltz. For more information, contact Myron Rogel, who is the Social Justice Coordinator at the Archdiocese or at the Diocese of Saskatoon, or Chris Hurenko. And I will post their emails in the chat so you can copy those if you're interested in that. I would also like to invite you, if you're interested in being part of the Archdiocesan Social Justice mailing list. We do have a newsletter that goes out periodically, informing people of events that are going on in the province, or different webinars such as this one that are going on that you can get involved with. So if that is something interesting to you, there is a link in the chat that you can click and sign up for. And the third thing I would like to let you know about is that the Center for Faith, Reason, Peace, and Justice is going to be co-hosting an exciting event on Islam, peace, and justice for the International Day of Peace, September 2022. And there's a call for papers. Oh, I think it's already in the chat. There's a call for papers if you're interested. And you can check that out as well. If you do have questions about that, you can again talk to Chris Hurenko, and you all have his email. And the final announcement that I have for this evening is, Senator, you talked about how Canada used to be leading, one of the leaders in peace, and about some of the work that we have done, and how we've actually been passed over in the last 2 elections for a seat at the General Security table at the UN, and how, what did you say, there's 30 peacekeeping missions or peacekeepers right now active. That's a mind-boggling number. So one of the great Canadians that we might know about peacekeeping missions is Romeo Dallaire, and he will be our presenter, our keynote speaker for next year's talk. So this exact event, but next year, will be Romeo Dallaire. And if you don't know about him, you should know about him. So that will be October 4th, 2022. And so when you signed up for this event, there was a little box that you could check to be made aware of upcoming events and to keep on the mailing list. So if you haven't done that, you can check that out. I also wanted to just point out that there is a YouTube channel where we have all these different presentations that have taken place. This is maybe the 3rd or 4th one now. And so they've been recorded and posted. There's a video on terra nullius and how we need to work together and to overcome some of that work, especially with Truth and Reconciliation, working towards some of those calls to action, recognizing them as church and as a larger society. And there have been a couple others Chris, I'm drawing blank. I'm so sorry. But he's going to find the link for us and we'll post it in the chat. So you can all go and check those out. And again, I just want to thank all of you for coming out. And I guess any last words, Senator Roche?
Well, I just want to thank you, Kasia, and Chris, and all of you here for participating in this. And our combined work on social justice is more important than we give ourselves credit for. Thank you very much to all of you, and thank you for having me.
Yes, thank you so much. And again, if you have any questions or would like to continue this conversation, you have our emails, so we'd love to hear from you. And with that, I think I will bid you all a good evening. Thanks for coming. God bless everyone. Take care. Bye-bye.